Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC, and it's an honor and merit of Rabbi Yosef Shlomo ben Risha for a complete and speedy refuah shlema. We are in Perek Chof Beis, chapter 22 in Tanya, continuing the themes of the divine unity and the opposite of its antithesis, which is duality and fragmentation and plurality, which really is encompassed in both of the first two commandments of the Aseret HaDibros. Anochi Hashem Elokecha is essentially divine unity. V'lo yeh lecha elokim acherim is negating the opposite. And how this is so central, because all the mitzvahs, as the Alter Rebbe said in the beginning of chapter 20, are encompassed in these two general, universal, first of the two Aseret HaDibros. So we discussed in chapter 20 and 21 the concept of that unity, using the operative example of dibur, because that's the word, that's the way Hashem describes how He creates existence. B'dvar Hashem shamayim nasu, asar ma'moris nivra elam. It's all an expression of dibur. So though dibur is not adequate, complete to explain how God functions, but yet God created, like we say, mepsari echzelakah, from our flesh, from my flesh I behold God, that from that we can come to understand how God functions. So He wants us to understand the process. So the Alter Rebbe has been explaining the similarities and the differences between our dibur and Hashem's dibur. Namely, in chapter 20 he spoke a lot about the idea that, like it is with our dibur, that one word, what is one word? What significance does it have compared to the infinite amount of power that we have words to speak in our lives? And definitely compared to our thought, and definitely compared to our faculties, even before it comes into a thought, or an idea, or feelings, as we explained. In chapter 21, he went on to say, so therefore that explains the insignificance of existence. That means how the divine unity is completely all-encompassing. In chapter 21, he continued to explain, and yet there's a difference, because our dibur, a human dibur, is ultimately outside of ourselves. You're expressing yourself to another. By God, there is no other. Ein davar chutz mimenu. Nothing's outside of Him. So in that sense, there's a big difference. So therefore, everything is within Him. And yet, it's still called dibur because it is a gili. He is expressing because He wants, so-called within Him, a creation of an independent consciousness. So from God's point of view, it's not independent. It's all part of the godliness. But from our point of view, God created a thing called dibur, and dibur is in a state through tzimtzumim and concealments that it creates a sense of independence. Now this doesn't mean it's an illusion. It's also part of God's reality that He created that type of consciousness. The goal is that we should come to understand with our consciousness, God's consciousness, and how we are all part of that consciousness. But initially, that's the experience. So that makes the unity even a deeper one. It's not just that existence is insignificant compared to the all-pervasive unity of the divine, but that existence is really all part of that one higher reality. So there's only one reality, Hashem Echad. But yet we still need to understand better what is this independent consciousness, and ultimately the fact that we live in a world where people can deny that connection, and furthermore live their own lives as if they're separate from God. All this is coming to lead up to how all our avodah, not just in the times when we're challenged, like he explained in chapters 18 and 19, that reveals the Ava Mesoteres, the deep love of the connection to God, when we're challenged with the Nisayon, the test of idolatry. But Bichlal, in general, all Torah mitzvahs, that when you're aware of that divine unity and negating anything outside of the divine, that will help us understand that all times a person can be Karev Elecha Davar Me'ed, because it's all part of one that higher reality, as we'll learn later in the chapters, the following chapters. So where are we now? In this chapter we began, chapter 22, continuing with the analogy of Dibur, says clearly that when the Torah uses the word Dibur on God, that God speaks, it's speaking the language of man. Interesting, that itself is also has within it the word Dibra. Torah Dibra v'Chaloshem b'nei Adam. The Torah is also speaking in the language of man, which means that that even though the simple explanation for that, the Gemara, where it says that idea, Dibra Torah b'Chaloshem b'nei Adam, in Brachas Lamed Aleph Beis, is talking, the Torah speaks, sometimes it says things that are, sometimes expressions, double expressions, and the question is, why does the Torah repeat itself? So it says, because it speaks in the way we speak. But the deeper meaning, as we see in Chazal and many Svarim that talk about Dibra Torah b'Chaloshem b'nei Adam, that it means that also when it talks about the language, we're associating anthropomorphic principles to God, like speech, or sight, or sound, that these are all the language that the Torah speaks. So the Alter Rebbe is giving a deeper interpretation. It's not just it's speaking in language like metaphor, but actually the physical reality, let's say our speech, is a reflection of divine revelation. So though there are the qualifications that there are differences, like the difference that in the Chadavar Chutz Mimenu, so God's speech is really not outside of him, but nevertheless, it's the connection between our speech, which really comes from God's speech, is reflective of the divine capacity of speech. So he continues with that. So when it calls Torah, Dibur Shel Mokim Baruch Hu, B'Shem Dibur Mamash, Ki Dibur Shel Adam. So when the Torah calls it Dibur, it's not just a metaphor, an example. It's deeper than that. It's Mamash, B'Shem Dibur Mamash, L'Fisha Be'emes Kachu. So it's not just a metaphor for us to understand. It's truth. That's exactly how God created it. So that just as the reality of God is that He's beyond dibur, and beyond machshava, beyond speech, and beyond thought, as we learned earlier. The fact of the matter is He's also the creator of speech. So therefore speech is a reflection of Him as well. It's not the only expression. It's not limited to that. And there's all the qualifications of differences, but the example is more than just an example. It's an actual manifestation of divine expression. And what is that expression? Because be'emes kachu derech yirides v'amshochas hachayis l'tachtenim b'tzimtzumim rabim v'atzumim. Says the word emes, derech lefisha be'emes. He wants to say that it's not just something from our perception, because then comes the big question. So all that we accomplish in this world is just for us? In other words, a mitzvah does not really do anything? Because from God's point of view, everything is part of the divine? No, because God created a reality where the divine revelation, the divine expression, goes through a state of yeridas v'amshachas hachayis. This energy goes through a process, level by level. And the energy is drawn downwards to the lower worlds through numerous and profound diminishments. This is all the reality. These diminishments are real. God is making these diminishments. These are not man-made. These are divine. Rabim v'atzumim, profound diminishments. Minim and minim shenim, meaning a variety of different types, as we learned. The bodis behem bruyim rabim minim and minim shenim, so to create a large variety, a multitude of different creations. So in other words, the tzimtzum are all defining, like when we say Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rekiya. This is defining the energy. Just to give a visual example, you shine, let's say, a projector of white light on a screen. You only see white light, but then you put a filter. You put, let's say, you put a film with images, or a film with letters on it, and suddenly you see the light is no longer white light. You see a light that's shining through. You see letters on the screen, or you see images on the screen. So who made that filter? That's also God. That filter is creating now defined different creations. The world, the mineral world, vegetable world, animal world, and human. And within each of them is a multitude of many species. How is that happening? Because the dibur is channeling and branching and, like, in a sense, channeling the energy into many different directions and different shapes and forms. So this all is a reality. Kachu be'emes, like he says. She'emes kachu. Now we're going to go, and this is where he's really leading up to the point, okay, because until then now you could say, okay, fine, that energy now is channeled into all kinds of different shapes and forms, but those shapes and forms are all, they lead us back to the source, all to that divine unity. Tanoichi Hashem Elokecha, Achdus, Shem Echad. However, these tzimtzumim also lead to the possibility and then the reality of Elokim Acherim, the second of the Ten Commandments. The possibility not just of diversity, but you can say even of divisiveness, a separation, where these entities feel, in their consciousness at least, they don't feel that connection to that oneness. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to explain with the same example how this dibur of Hashem ultimately leads to all the forces in this world that deny and even deny and defy the divine unity. And that's why it comes the second commandment. Not just the first, that everything is unified, but how to deal with that situation. So what does he say? And as we learn this, I'm just going over it again, but in more detail. V'kol kach govru, v'otzma hatzimtzumim. And these diminishments, the hester ponim el yenim, and the hiding of the divine, the higher divine God's face. El yenim. When God's face means it's a revealed, a facial experience, you're seeing the face of God. So all these diminishments are kol kach gavri v'otzma, they're so enormous. You could say so profound, so overwhelming, so overpowering. At sheyuchlu lisavas ulivoris gam dvarim tmeim v'klipas v'sitra achra. Not just diversity, like we said, different letters, different species, different shapes and forms, but to the point that it enables to cause the creation, the creation of impure things, klippas, shells and husks, and sitra achra, which is the other side of kedusha. So now we're talking about a real concealment that actually creates a consciousness that is antithetical to godliness. Not just that it's diverse in contrast to God's unity. Ulakabel chayusim v'kiyumam, and he goes even further. That's the creation. But furthermore, to receive, to be sustained. To receive and be sustained their energy from God's words. The Kabbalah Chiyuv v'Kiyum midvar Hashem. Again, from the Dvar Hashem, v'ruach piv, Yizborach, from the God's word and the breath of his mouth, behester ponim v'yeridas hamadreges. Through this hiding of God's face and the descent through the different levels and stages of the cosmic order in order to sustain these entities. So, number one is the creation of them. Number two, the sustenance of them. And now, based on that, now that we've established that, that's what the Dibur creates. So in this sense, God's Dibur, as much as it's unlike our speech, because nothing is outside of him, but its impact is like our impact. When we speak to another, there is another. And the other is not necessarily us. And the other could also be disagreeing with us and could defy us. So even though from God's perspective nothing is outside of him, but now he's created through that filter, through the filters of the Tzimtzum, a reality that is like another. And in its consciousness it's another, and it's be'emes like that. Not an illusion. Because it's also part of God's reality. The goal is to get beyond that and transcend it and reconnect and understand that really we're all part of Dvar Hashem. But this concealment itself is also part of godliness. If you remember the end of chapter 21, he actually said, Hashem hu alikim. The tzimtzum itself is also, not just that God employed a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is also his power. So now, with this, the Alter Rebbe now comes to explain what does it mean, lo yeh lecha alikim acherim. What is Elikim Acherim? Why is it called Elikim Acherim? And of course, why we're told, Lo yeh lecha Elikim Acherim. In other words, we should not allow ourselves to buy into this perception. So though the tzimtzum is real, but it doesn't mean we need to conclude from that we're separate from God. So let's first explain what means Elikim Acherim. So the Medrash, Mechilta, Rashi explain Elikim Acherim means, many people teach it means other gods, which simply, seemingly is the pshat, not to have other gods. There's one God, our God. But they teach that it means, Elikim Acherim means that it should not be by Acherim, the Elikim that others worship, meaning others that are not worshiping our God. Hashem echad, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So in other words, it's talking about by the Evdei Avodah Zarah, those that are idol worshippers, there are others who are worshipping gods. So don't be embracing those people in their perspective. However, when you think about it, Elikim Acherim is also referring to not just the other people, the Acherim that are worshipping other gods, but also the gods themselves. What does that mean? So the Alter Rebbe says, L'chein nikroim Elikim Acherim. And that's why the term other gods, Elikim Acherim, is used in reference to what? To the klippas. We're not just talking about the people, but the klippas themselves. Why? Because you're talking that the klippas, in a sense, distort the very divine energy that manifests within them, as he's going to explain. And the key word here is acherim. When you say acherim, it also has the meaning of, like from the word ocher, from the behind, from the back, from the behind. Ponim is from the front. From the back is acherim. Like when we say, "V'ri'ises acherai, u'ponai lo yiro," you see my back side, but not my front, not my face. So he's going to explain now what this word acherim means, which gives a whole other dimension. It's not just other gods or others who are worshipping false gods. It's because it describes what kind of elikim, how it describes exactly the relationship they have. Because here's the big question. If there's nothing outside of God, how can there be other gods? So it says, "Mepnei sheyinikosam v'chayusam enim b'chinas ponim." Because these forces, they're drawing energy. Yinika comes from the word like suckling. They're sucking energy or nursing. Their ability to sap, if you wish, energy. V'chayusam. Sheyinikosam v'chayusam, and their sustenance and their energy is not from level of ponim. Ponim refers to when God reveals something in a very direct way. As he's going to explain, when you love someone and you show them your face and you smile and you give them something. But it's not coming from Ponim. Elo mebchinas acharayim de Kedusha. Now, I should mention that the Tikkun Zeyar teaches Alikim Acherim in this way. The Tikkun Zeyar, which is on page, I believe it's Tikkun Zeyar Chaf Aleph, the Tikkun 21, page Nun Vav Aleph, 56a, and the additions we use. So, it's not coming from the face, it's coming from Acharayim de Kedusha, from the back. He's going to now explain what that means with an example. So the point is this. When you talk about the divine unity that's all-encompassing, we talk in concept of lifnei tzimtzum, meaning prior to any of the tzimtzumim, including the first tzimtzum. So then, everything is one seamless unity. So there's no ponim and no acharayim, there's no front, no back. As soon as God created that tzimtzum, you now have two states, the revealed state and a concealed state. So a concealed state, like we learned earlier, it itself has levels. There's a concealed state, but it's not yet defiant or antithetical to the divine. There's a concealed state to the point, Gavru va'otzma tzimtzumim, that can create klippos v'sitra achra, like we said, we just read earlier. Dvorim tmeim v'klippos v'sitra achra. The concept of ponim and achar means that God created now so-called two tracks. A track where the direct energy that is giving in a revealed way, and acharayim is, like he said, that's coming from the back side, so to speak. Upirush acharayim, says the Alter Rebbe, is going to give an example. Ka'odem haneisen dover l'seinei shalei b'r'seinei. Like a person who must give something to another, but it's against his will, doesn't want to. He has no choice, so to speak. So obviously we can't say that on God there's no choice, because here he chose. But the form of way he's giving it is like begrudgingly, if you wish. But that's the example. So how do you do that? If you have two people standing before you, one person who you love and you want to give them a gift, another person standing who you really don't want to give it, but for whatever reason you need to give it to them. So the process, the one that you love, you give them with a smiling face, you look at them, you offer it to them. The other person, you give it in a way that's almost as dismissive way. Shemashlichi lo kala acher kaspe. Shemashlichi lo kala acher ksefe, I should say. It's like throwing it backwards over his shoulder. It's like saying, you know what, here it is, so it just throws it, and not like in a face-to-face way. Ki machzir ponov mimenu misinose ese. Because he has turned his face away from the person he despises or hates out of misinose, out of his hatred for him. Whatever reason, he's giving it to him, but he's not giving it to him in a way that, in a direct way. It's a very indirect way and very dismissive way. So you're throwing it over your back. That's the example. Back is acharayim. Front face is face to face. Someone you love, you're not going to just throw to them something over your back. Kach l'mayla, says the Alter Rebbe. So too, similarly above. B'chinas ponim u'pnimis harotzen ha'elyon v'cheftzei amiti. The face, God's face symbolizes, represents his inner and, you could say, most inherent will, his actual will. Rotzen ha'elyon means the desire, and true desire. Because you could have rotzen, chefetz is like the primis harotzen. You really desire it. So all these things. It's primis harotzen ha'elyon v'cheftzei amiti. His inner actual will and his true desire. I'll explain in a moment with an example. Asher chefetz Hashem lashpia chayes l'chol hakorevei love mesita d'kedusha. And what is this inner desire? What does God want? He wants to give to every. He wants to bestow life energy from kedusha, from holiness, to all that are close to him. He loves them. It's like loving your children. You want to give them everything they need. That's called coming from primis harotzen ha'elyon v'cheftzei amiti. That's the one you give the gift to face to face. Obviously, this is all a metaphor. We said before, dibra teira b'lashon b'nei adam. But nevertheless, the example works very well. But what about the one you're throwing it over your back? How does that work in the nimshal, in the moral? Sitra achra and impurity are an abomination of God, which He detests. So it's expression from Sefer Dvarim, Yud Beis Lamed Aleph. Ve'ena mashpia lo chayis meprimis harotzen v'chefse amitya shechefes ba. And He doesn't give these negative forces a life energy from His inner will and from a place of His true desire that He delights in. Chaz v'shalom, God forbid. Ki im keman the shadei bosar kasre l'sene. It's in Aramaic, the same idea that he said before, rather like a person who throws something over his shoulder. It's from the Zohar, Chele Gimel, Kuf Pei Daled Amid Aleph, 184a, to his enemy. Shalei b'ritzene. Not wanting to do so. Now, obviously, God is doing it because He wants to do so, but He's doing it, the want is like a not want. He's doing it because He wants to create a world where you have that, so we should transform the world. That's its purpose, as we'll discuss momentarily. So to use an example, what you see from here is really three things. There are three types of dimensions. You want to build a home for yourself or for your children. So what's Primis Ratzon V'Cheftzei in this context? Is the home. A home, a shelter, more than a shelter. An environment they can live in, they can be protected, they can enjoy life, educate their children, have guests, all the things that a home offers. But in order to build a home, you need resources. You need to bring in a contractor and architects to build it. So that's not called Primis HaRatzon, that's really Chetzenis HaRatzon. The Ratzon, the Primis HaRatzon, to build a home requires you to do certain things that are a means to an end. Obviously, if you can get a home miraculously from above, that would be great, but that's not how it works. Now, Chetzenis HaRatzon is still part of an extension of the Primis HaRatzon, but it doesn't have quite the same, it's the means to an end. But you could also be passionate about it, and you could also immerse yourself, because you want to get into the details of how this room should be built, and these details and those details. Then there's what he calls Acharayim HaRatzon, things that have to be done, but it's not what you want. It's not even means to an end in the sense for the building of the home. It's things that are actually the opposite. Why? We'll talk about why God created it in order to transform, make a dira b'tachtenim. So that also requires energy to exist, but it's not something you want to directly give. The first level is obviously Primis HaRatzon's Ponim Mamash. The second is, you can say, like the Chetzenius of the Primis. And then there's something that is Acharayim, the Ratzon. We'll elaborate on this more in the next shir. We'll stop here. TanyaApplied.com is where this and all programs can be found. Everyone have a good Tavach, a good Chodesh El, Ksiv V'Chsimat Tov.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.